Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Azumullah hujurana wa ujurakum bimusabina bil Hussein alayhi salam. In this series, we are exploring the life and legacy of one of the most prominent figures in the movement of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam, that is to say, Hazrat Zaynab, peace be upon her, who played a very important role in bringing the message of the Imam alayhi salam to the world. We are joining you from the holy site of Masjid al-Hanana, a masjid which is renowned for different things. It is narrated that when Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu salam had been killed, when he was martyred in his prayer, as his sons were bearing his body towards Najaf al-Ashraf, this mosque felt so much sadness and so much sympathy over what had happened to Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, that it actually inclined a bit towards him, as if to give its respects. And also, this is one of the places where it is said the head of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam was placed for some time. The prisoners, the captives, the survivors after the tragedy in Karbala were also brought here. And so, it is a very fitting place for us to be remembering what happened on that day. The day of Ashura, the day which Allah Ta'ala refers to in His holy book as a day of great sacrifice. وَفَدَيْنَاهُ بِذِبْحٍ عَظِيمٍ. It was a day on which the heavens rained blood, the sun was eclipsed, and every being in the heavens and the earth mourned the loss of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam. This day, the day of Ashura, is very difficult for us, is very painful for us. So how much more difficult must it have been for Sayyida Zaynab, peace be upon her? Because not only was it a day on which these tremendous atrocities were committed, but it was a day on which she would lose those people who were closest to her. She would lose her own flesh and blood. She would lose her children, her own children, whom she had raised herself. She would lose the most important people to her, Abu Fadl Abbas alayhi salam, and of course the Imam alayhi salam. And yet it is said that when people are under severe pressure, when we are going through times of immense trial, that is when, in fact, our true reality shines forth most clearly. And thus, it was on this day that the companions of the Imam alayhi salam were tried and were tested and achieved their great accomplishment, such that we say, Ya laytana kunna ma'akum fanafuza ma'akum. We wish that we could have achieved this great accomplishment they did through giving their lives in the path of Allah with the Imam alayhi salam. And similarly, when it comes to Hazrat Zaynab, peace be upon her, beginning on the day of Ashura, the eyes of history turned towards her. And even though she had all of these beautiful characteristics before, the faith, the patience, the eloquence, the forbearance, the wisdom, the knowledge, it is on this day and on the events that followed the calamity on the day of Ashura that we truly see who Sayyida Zaynab alayha salam was, that her mark is left on history forever. It is hard to know where to begin when talking about the loss that Sayyida Zaynab, peace be upon her, endured on that day. We know that she gave her own children in that battle. Some people say that Aun was only 13 years old when he went out to fight against this vicious enemy. There were so many soldiers everywhere, big men who had no hesitation from committing any sort of violence towards the family of the Prophet ﷺ. And we, in our gatherings and our majalis, we mourn for her children. Sometimes we give a special night to Aun and Muhammad to remember them, to give them the honor that they deserve. And yet we also know that Hazrat Zaynab alayhi salam, she herself held back from grieving over her own sons. She herself held back from mourning over them on that day. And not only on that day, but all the way until they reached Kufa. All the way until they reached Sham, until finally she had returned home in Medina. That was the first time that she truly had the opportunity to grieve over their loss. because she knew she had to stay strong on the day of Ashura. The Imam alayhi salam had given her an immense responsibility, and she could not afford to be distracted from it. And there were so many losses for her on that day that were very difficult. One of the most painful, in addition to her own children, of course, was Ali al-Akbar, the son of Al-Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And on the one hand, this is because she was very close to the Imam, and also she was very close to his children. But in addition to that, historians agree that Ali al-Akbar looked exactly like the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was like looking at an image of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Sayyida Zaynab alayhi salam, when she was a child, she had seen the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with her own eyes. And historians agree that when Ali al-Akbar went into battle, it was as if the Prophet himself was standing before all of these enemies who claimed to say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, and yet they brutally and mercilessly slaughtered him. And Sayyida Zaynab not only had to bear the grief of watching and knowing Ali al-Akbar was being killed, but also she was deeply concerned over the Imam. The Imam himself could not bring himself to say yes to Ali al-Akbar when he asked to go out to fight. He could not bear to say yes, knowing that his son would soon be cut to pieces for no sin except standing up for the way of Allah and the truth. However, the Imam could also not say no. The Imam could not say no because Shahada was the sunnah of Ahlul Bayt alayhimu salam. From the cradle to the end of their lives, they were raised to live in the way of Allah and to give their lives in the way of Allah. Martyrdom was their sunnah and their honor. This is why we say, Allahumma jal mahyaya mahya Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa mamati mamata Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad alayhimu salam. And thus, Ali al-Akbar understood from the silence of the Imam that he had been permitted to go out to fight. And he did. And Hazrat Zaynab alayha salam, she was also there when her brother, this most beloved person to her, had to be in a situation that no father would want to be in. When Ali al-Akbar comes back from the battle, he says, Father, is there just a drop of water for me to drink? The thirst has killed me. And the Imam has nothing. He has nothing he can give to his son who is suffering. All he can say to him is, Wa ghawtha, oh my son, O Ali, soon you'll be reunited with your grandfather Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi in heaven. And after that, he will quench your thirst and you will never feel thirst again. And she was there when the blood of Ali al-Akbar flowed into the eyes of his horse. His horse ran off to the enemy camp and the enemy slaughtered him. They cut him into pieces as he was calling out, Alayka minni salam. The Imam could not bear to carry the body of his son back to the tent. It was too difficult for him. And his grief was so immense that Sayyida Zaynab, peace be upon her, it's related that she thought the Imam might die from his grief. And so not only because she too was deeply shocked and deeply mourning his loss, but because she felt she needed to do something to take the burden off of the Imam, she calls out, Wa Aliya, Wa ibn Akha, O Ali al-Akbar. And she throws herself by the body of Ali al-Akbar, her nephew. And this is not the only time she had to bear the grief of other people. After the day of Ashura, the same happened to Imam Ali Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, as he looked out at the headless bodies scattered around the battlefield, full of blood, their limbs severed. He saw how the horses had trampled the sacred body of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam. His body had been looted. The enemies had spared no sanctity of theirs. And he himself began to grieve deeply. And so it was Sayyida Zaynab salamullahi alayha who went to him, and she comforted him with knowledge that he too had, but she comforted him and said, yes, this is a very difficult time. But think about what will happen in the future. In generations to come, centuries to come, people will remember what happened. There will be a flag that will fly over this site. It will inspire people for generations. The enemies of Allah, those who try to put out the light of Allah and the light of Ali Muhammad alayhi salam, they will try very hard to stop people from remembering the Imam. But doing so will only increase his remembrance around the world. And that this was the destiny to come, even though these times were very difficult for them now. But undoubtedly, most difficult for Sayyida Zaynab alayhi salam, and indeed most difficult for us, something that is very difficult for us to speak about too, were those last moments that the Imam had alayhi salam as he went into battle, when he gave his final farewell to the survivors, the women and the children. It's related that at that moment, the Imam was surrounded by children. He was surrounded by orphans. They were clinging to him everywhere, his arms, his beard, his legs. And he calls out, "Alaykunna minni salam." Farewell, this is the last time you will see me. And he gives his will to Sayyida Zaynab again. He reminds her, "Zaynab, the widows and orphans I entrust to your care. You must lead them and console them, for I will not be there. Keep them from harm and see to each need. Stand between them and the tyrant's meanness and greed. I am also entrusting you with my poor ailing son and my dear Ruqayya, the youngest one. We have never been parted for as much as a day, so console her young spirit in your own special way." The Imam went out. We know what happened at that time. And it is related that after the valiant stand of the Imam, Sukaina, the daughter of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, heard a horse coming back to the camp. She heard horses' hooves galloping towards them. And she goes out. She thinks that her father has returned to them, but instead she sees that the horse is covered in blood. It's riderless, its rider is no more, and its saddle is disheveled. And she calls out to Sayyida Zaynab. She calls out to Sayyida Zaynab, peace be upon her, "Amma Zaynab, my father has been killed." And Sayyida Zaynab salamullahi alayha, according to the reports, she rushes out to the battlefield where she sees the Imam lying there. And this is truly when the words of Sayyida Zaynab salamullahi alayha began to be recorded. She looks at her brother, she looks at the enemy, she calls out, "O Muhammad, O Ali, O Hamza, O Ja'far." She is calling out to all these people who are not standing there. Would that the heavens had crashed to the earth. Would that the mountains had crumbled into pieces. Umar ibn Sa'd, the enemy commander who was instigating all of this, he approached. Lesser people might have been scared, but not Sayyida Zaynab, peace be upon her. She had this courage, she faces him. She says, "Ibn Sa'd, Abu Abdullah is going to be killed while you're looking on?" This is a man who had a very hard heart. This is the man who had ordered that Abdullah Radi be killed. And yet, it is related that at the words of Sayyida Zaynab, peace be upon her, blood began to flow. Tears began to flow from his eyes, indeed, as if it was blood. And it said that on that day, as Sayyida Zaynab salamullahi alayha mourned the loss of her brother, there was so much crying and lamenting among the enemies. It was as if such sadness had never been seen before, even though moments before they had been willing to do anything to try to destroy the Imam. And this, indeed, we see was one of the powers of Sayyida Zaynab, peace be upon her. That although she was not fighting with a weapon, although she did not stand there with a sword, she was able to open people's eyes to the truth. She was able to open people's eyes to recognize, to see the truth, to realize it, and in this case, to realize the tragedy that had unfolded. In the next episodes, we will look at what means Sayyida Zaynab, peace be upon her, used. What weapons, if you will, she used to carry out this responsibility, because she did not bear a spear, she did not wield a sword, and yet she was able to stand firm and defend the survivors and defend the new Imam against the enemies. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.